Hello everyone, in this video here I'll be doing a demonstration on how to refinish the wipers on your vehicle. Now as you can see here, the one wiper is fairly faded, and what's happened over time is the paint started to chip off the aluminum casting as well as the steel part where it's starting to rust here, and it can be quite the eyesore on a vehicle itself. Now on the other wiper here I've already refinished it just to give you an idea what it does look like when it's done. Now you can repaint the wipers on the vehicle itself, but the problem is you do have to worry about overspray and taping the vehicle off. The best way I would recommend to do it is actually removing the wipers from the vehicle itself. Now, this does vary with the way they do attach to each vehicle here. Now what I have here is a 99 Subaru Forester, and these are held on with a 10mm bolt, and basically the wiper arm is on a tapered spline shaft. Now other vehicles could be slightly different. Some do have a cap over top if they're not exposed to the bolts itself. This is something you have to look up yourself just to determine how to remove them. Now for this particular one here, once the nut is removed, normally what happens is because the wiper's been on there for so long, it's still stuck on the shaft itself. So what I actually have here, just a simple battery puller, works great. I do have the wipers in the upright position here, just so they're easier to get out with a battery puller because it does hit on the plastic cowl itself. Now once you have the nut loose on the shaft here, what I've done is just replace the battery puller on top here. Don't remove the nut fully because it does protect the threads on the end. Normally what you want to do is make sure the nut and the shaft sticking out is flush, but in this scenario here it's kind of hard to do. So I just leave the nut on there just to protect the threads, so in case this does slip off, you don't end up mashing up the threads there and having a hard time putting the nut back on. Now this one here I just had to simply tighten it up and the arm itself just popped off. Sometimes if you have a little harder time you can just take a hammer and tap it ever so slightly on the end here just to rattle it loose. Now you want to be careful when you are doing this because the shafts do sit in bushings and there is linkage in behind there, so you don't want to start beating on it too hard because you can risk breaking something in behind, and a lot of times you can't buy those replacement parts separately, so you have to buy a whole new unit and it can get very costly. Now once you remove the wiper arm itself, you should have something that looks like this. Now normally I don't recommend removing the wipers off the actual arm itself before you do remove it off the vehicle. This is a spring-loaded arm here. You can see there is the pivot point right there, and if you do pull it up and accidentally it does slip out of your hand, you do risk the possibility of it chipping your windshield. So this is just kind of a protection here. Now it's just easy to remove the wiper itself once the arm's off. There's a little tab you just depress in there. What I'll do is I'll link up my how to replace the wipers in the video description below, and if you're having any trouble removing the wiper, just watch that video and see how it's done. Now you can see here the paint's chipping away. Normally what I like to do is just take a little scraper and just clean off any of the excess chipping paint. You can see here how easy it does flake off. So what I do is usually clean this all up here, and then after what I'll do is I'll go over it with sandpaper. Now I'll probably use about a 2000 grit sandpaper because the aluminum here is fairly corroded, so we want to smooth it all down nicely. And we also don't want a hard edge here. What happens if we do have a hard edge, if you do go over it with paint after, you'll notice it right away, and it tends to be a little more work intensive to actually get rid of when we're using the primer. And once you sanded down the wiper arm, you should have something that looks like this. And I've also sanded the back side too as well. Now just a recap of what I did here, you can see now where the bare aluminum was, it was fairly corroded, so what I did here is I went down with 200 grit sandpaper. And then I use a 200 grit sandpaper in order to feather down these edges here so you don't actually have a hard edge when you are painting the item itself. Once I went over this area here along with other just small rust spots, as well as the rust spots along here with a 200 grit, I finished up with a 400 grit, which is finer. Normally what happens if you use a coarser grit sandpaper and you do paint it, sometimes you'll see the sanding marks of the paint itself, and won't look like an actual finished product. Now next what I'll be doing here is I'll be moving on with a filler primer here. You can see here now you can use just an ordinary primer, but the filler primer tends to fill up any of the little dimples, or maybe you have a couple little scratches or stone chips in there which you haven't been able to sand out. And what this will do is make it nice and smooth finish, so when you do go over it with the black, everything will blend in quite nicely. Now once you've primed the object, now you have to wait for it to dry. Now with normal primer, the non-filler based primer, usually it'll dry within about 15 minutes and you should be good to go and handle it. Now if you are using a filler based primer and you do happen to put on a little bit of heavier coats, normally you have to wait for it to be able to handle it, maybe about a half an hour. It does take a little bit longer because it is a thicker style primer. Now another thing I also forgot to mention before you do primer this, I already did give it a wipe down. What you want to do is just give it a wipe down with a degreaser. Sometimes what happens if somebody's oiled the bushings down in here, maybe there might be a little oil residue on the end there, so you want to make sure that's all nice and clean and it doesn't have any contamination in your paint. The other thing the primer also helps do, besides filling in any crevices or anything like that, is on the bare metal it does create a barrier, so it does prevent it from rusting again or corroding. As well, it also helps the paint stick better to the material itself. Now I just gave the piece a first coat of black paint here, as you can see. Now just before I did apply the coat of paint, I did give the piece one last sand down with 400 grit sandpaper, just to ensure if any dust particles did get within the primer before it did fully harden. It just knocks the high spots off, because you will notice it after when you paint the black paint on. Black paint has a tendency to show a lot of imperfections. As for the paint I'm using here, now you can use a flat black, but I find it doesn't actually stand up to the weather as well, and it doesn't look the OEM factory look as it would be when the car was new. You could go with a gloss black. Sometimes it might stick out a little too much with the gloss black, and if there is any imperfections in it, it has a tendency to show more. Now this particular paint here I'm using is a low gloss or a satin black. Basically this is what it is here. It's a Duplicolor, a high fleet coating. I just purchased it at my local auto parts store. Now they also do have a gloss version in this as well. Now I find this does give a fairly nice finish. It just gives the right look as what it would look like at factory. Now as for applying how many coats here, I start with the bottom first, and I'll be applying 3 coats, both the bottom and the top side of it, just to ensure full coverage and a nice clean finish once it's done. The reason I start with the bottom first is that if there's any overspray, the last part that you will look at is the top piece, so you want that to have a nice smooth finish. So if there's any overspray, it'll be more consumed to the bottom of the part itself here. Now you do have to flip it over. Unless you do hang it up, you might be able to eliminate any overspray, so you won't have to worry about this, but in this scenario here I'm just placing this on a couple pieces of wood and that's it. Now I just gave it my final coat of paint here. Now I've applied 3 coats to this already. Now what I'll do, this isn't fast dry like the primer I just mentioned earlier was. This does take a little time to dry. So normally what I would do is just leave this part sitting out in the sun for I would say about 3 to 4 hours to let it dry, so you can flip it over. Normally what will happen is if you do flip it over too early, you can see where the parts it does sit on. So say if I do flip it over here, what will happen is if it's sitting on the wood here and does touch these areas here, it will leave marks in there, so you don't want that. So once this is dry, after 3 or 4 hours dry time, I will flip it over and then continue on to the top side of the part itself. So once you give them the wiper about 24 hours to dry, the paint's then ready to handle, and you can continue to put it back on your vehicle. Now as for the position, just make note of what the position was previously. You can see here there's still a little bit of dirt on the windshield there, so it kind of gives a witness mark of where the wiper arm itself did sit in a down position. Normally if you have a little black stripe along the bottom here, they do sit just below that edge, or just somewhat on the edge of that black stripe. Or they'll be, when you're looking straight at the vehicle, they'll be fairly level. Now these are adjustable. Now the spline it does fit on, it is able to rotate in any direction. So you want to make sure, once you've installed your wiper, you want to ensure that it is snug down nicely, because what will happen is if you don't snug it down all the way, the shaft will end up slipping on the wiper arm itself. You just want to give your wipers a quick run in the upwards position and then down again to make sure they don't hit any window trim or say the hood or anything like that, depending on the make and model of your vehicle and how they're designed. Now, as a final product, you should be left with something that looks like this. Thank you for watching my tutorial video. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to post them below. Also, please subscribe to my channel for further tutorial videos, as well as rate this video. Thank you.